Let's start this video off by explaining the difference between a dry mix of concrete and a wet mix of concrete. The dry mix would be something that you have not added water to before placing it in the forms, and a wet mix would be something you've added water to and mixed thoroughly before placing it into your forms. And this might sound weird, but this is actually what most of the directions are going to require when building anything out of concrete. However, there is one product I found that allows you to use a dry mixture. You're just simply allowed to pour the dry mix into a footing you're going to use for a fence post. And then after you've added the dry mix, you can thoroughly saturate it with water. Then you're going to get the chemical reaction you need to make the concrete hard. And of course, the reason why I'm making this video is because I found a couple of people on the internet claiming that you could just simply fill the areas in between your form boards with a dry mix of concrete and then wetting it, thoroughly soaking the water into the concrete mix to get the chemical reaction required to make the concrete hard. Now, I don't know if this is going to create something strong enough for your project, but I can tell you that something like this probably won't work for a walkway or a porch, especially if we remove the forms. If you pour the mix and leave the forms, you're going to have a protective barrier around the perimeter. However, once you remove the forms, over time, you could end up cracking a section off of the site that would look something like this. And I'm also not going to suggest that something like this couldn't happen to a mix that you mixed thoroughly before pouring. So to wrap this video up, this is not something I recommend doing. Follow the directions on the concrete bag, and if you're looking for a little more structural strength, add some rebar, and make sure that all of your concrete is poured on a solid, compacted fill material, not loose soil. Here is a follow-up video to a video I made about a week ago about whether or not to use a dry concrete mix instead of a wet concrete mix for your small projects, and are going to try using this dry pour method anyway. Now, the number one problem I see on the internet that has a high probability of failure, whether you're using a dry mix or a wet mix, will be to make the concrete pads at least 3.5 inches thick. Because I've already seen a couple that turned out just fine in the video, but I don't think are going to work in the long run. My next idea would be to raise the form boards up a little bit so that when you're watering your concrete slab, that it will create some type of a container that will allow most of the water to go through the concrete. Because there were a couple of videos that I came across with a concrete slab that wasn't very strong because the water hadn't soaked through it. And if you don't raise the forms, it wouldn't be a bad idea to be careful when you're wetting the concrete to prevent any water from going over the edge of the form boards. Because if water's going over the form boards, there's a good chance that the cement is also going over the form boards, and that's not going to help your finish. Now, if you do want a smoother finish, here's something else that might work. And that would be to screed all of the rocks down to where they're about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch lower than the form boards. And then add a layer of Portland cement. The Portland cement should allow you to get a smoother finish or even a nicer broom finish if that's something you're interested in doing. If not, then you could end up with a rougher finish. But again, this might not be a problem for you, especially if you're not planning on finishing the concrete at all with any types of trowels to smooth out the concrete or to round off the edges. Another thing I would definitely suggest doing, I just watched a video where somebody placed a dry mix on top of some wood chips. And over time, these wood chips can decompose and create a void or an area that's underneath your concrete that will no longer be supporting the concrete pad. Make sure that everything you build is on top of a solid foundation or well-compacted soil. I cannot stress this enough, because if you're looking for cracks, soil erosion, tree roots, and uncompacted soil are probably going to be at the top of the list. And of course, why not throw some rebar in there or some type of a wire mesh, something that you're going to use for a wet concrete mix. to see if that will help increase the strength. And if you're using a 3.5-inch thick slab, the rebar will be placed somewhere in the center. And you could probably position the rebar after filling up about an inch, inch and a half of dry mix in your forms, and then simply setting the rebar on top of that, and then filling it up the rest of the way. And the last thing I want to point out is that most of these pre-mixed bags are rated at about 2,000 to 2,500 pounds per square inch. Here's what a square inch looks like, 1 inch by 1 inch. Even if you're only getting 500 pounds per square inch, with your dry mix concrete, that might be enough for your project. So keep that in mind also. Now, the last thing I want to say in this video is that I am not 100% convinced that we need to hit something like this with a sledgehammer or drive a truck over it. Because if all you're going to do is put a chicken coop on top of it, and you're never or rarely ever going to step on it, then something like this might work fine. But if you're going to do that, why not just form something up and fill it with gravel and avoid using concrete, whether wet or dry mixed? And for me, I'm not 100% convinced that this is the best way to go for anything, including a small concrete pad, until one of these products tells you in their directions that you're allowed to use the dry pour concrete method and tells you what you can use that method for. Here's another one of those crazy ideas I found on YouTube that I don't think is going to work. And I'm not about to suggest that you can't do this in a different way, but I am about to suggest that I have a few things you need to think about before stacking a bunch of concrete bags on top of each other to create a retaining wall. Now, maybe if you're going to use this for 6 rows or less, 6 rows of concrete bags, maybe you're not going to have a problem. And maybe if you stack them differently, you might not have a problem. But what I'm about to show you here should provide you with everything you need to know about why your large retaining wall built out of concrete bags probably isn't going to work. So let's take a look at a regular retaining wall. It's usually going to be built something like this. It's going to have a large footing with a bunch of rebar in it to prevent the soil or the moisture in the soil from pushing the wall over. And I don't know how you're going to do that just by stacking bags on top of each other. So even if the bags were to hold, you're still going to be dealing with the pressure from the soil behind the bags. And in reality, that's all you need to know for the video. You can stop watching it right here, because I don't think by rearranging the bags somehow you're going to solve this problem. And of course, we can take a look at what the wall's eventually going to look like after the paper wears off, which might not be a big deal, except for the mess that it's going to make on your property. And another problem you could deal with will be tree roots. And trust me, the tree roots will love a wall like this where they can get the roots in between the bags. And then, of course, do what they do best. And that will be to get a little larger over time and speed up the process of destroying a wall like this. So what if we go ahead and put some plastic or some type of a moisture barrier behind the bags of concrete? Will this solve our problem? Probably not. Again, we don't have the large footing like we have over here, or a structurally reinforced solid wall. And even if we can prevent the tree roots or moisture from coming through here, we might not be able to prevent it from going underneath or prevent the massive amount of soil behind the retaining wall from pushing this thing over. And if you do use the plastic, you're going to have to make sure that it is positioned in a way to eliminate all of the moisture from coming through and not just some of it. Because in a situation like this, all of the moisture that settles on the ground in front of the retaining wall can soak up into the lower section. The moisture that's behind the top of the retaining wall can go around it if the moisture barrier isn't tall enough. And I'm not about to suggest that trapping the moisture behind the retaining wall is going to be a good idea either. It could increase the force behind the retaining wall and cause it to fail. And an example of that might look something like this, where we have the wall tilting forward at the top. Another thing most retaining walls will have will be a gravel-lined section behind it and some type of a drainage system that will allow the water that gets trapped behind the retaining wall to be removed from this area. Another thing I would like to point out is that the back of the retaining wall is usually going to have some type of waterproofing material to prevent moisture from absorbing into the retaining wall from this side. And for those of you who want to build this wall out of your concrete bags anyway, and you're thinking, hey, why don't I just install the gravel behind my concrete bags along with my drainage system? And that's probably not going to work. You can remove the water. You can prevent the tree roots from entering into the bags, along with the water that's going to be trying to go around this thing, will usually be enough to destroy a taller wall. And I don't know what the height of that wall would be, but I can tell you that something like this is going to work a lot better than something a little taller. Now, I wouldn't use this method, period. This would not be something I would be using for a straight retaining wall. I've seen this done on curved retaining walls. You might have a better chance at something like that working than you will a straight wall, because I've seen small retaining walls built out of sandbags before that seem to work pretty good until the canvas surrounding the sandbag starts to fall apart.